So the talk that I'm giving actually is a smaller excerpt from a larger book project that I've recently completed that is based on roughly 9 years of work spent in Dharavi for the most part. The largest span was about 1.5 years of ethnographic fieldwork. But my effort was largely an effort to situate the project in a larger historical context. And one of the questions that I was seeking to answer with the project specifically concerned sort of the irrationality of land and property markets. And specifically, why such a centrally located, and thinking about location as sort of the determinant or one of the key determinants of property prices, this particularly located settlement in the center of the city, adjacent to all of the city's major railway lines and directly adjacent to the Bandra Kurla complex and accessible to the international airport, how this area has actually been able to resist or sustain itself in the face of a whole slew of slum upgradation programs and land transformation programs that have been attempted in this area. So in many ways, I'm actually sort of picking up on this question of the failed PPPs. So looking at the Dharavi redevelopment project as taking the opportunity that Ananya suggested we might do and look at the failure of a particular project and conduct something of an autopsy on it to understand why projects like these continually fail and what we might understand about more effective insertions into the city's built environment and into housing and property specifically. So the dominant frameworks that have really been used to look at, within sociology and geography, to look at land transformation, land conversion programs along these lines pretty much fall in the category of sort of land grabs and dispossession and what geographer David Harvey talks about as accumulation by dispossession. And while those processes are certainly underway in Mumbai and in other Indian cities, as many people here have written about, these are not sort of the totality of the processes that are actually underway, and focusing exclusively on the ways that land development projects are in many ways land grabs overlooks where land grabs are actually unsuccessful, and people are actually able to exert their right to stay put within these highly contested, potentially valuable, centrally located pieces of property. So in many ways also, this project is an effort to sort of flesh out what is in many ways the unsatisfying narrative of the vote bank, sort of the idea that spaces like these exist simply because of rent-seeking behaviors and the ways that politicians protect their constituencies and seek to keep their constituencies locked in place. And while I think rent-seeking might be a useful framework, there are these local politicians who represent these residents and these constituencies are actually no match for the larger central and state government officials and the land speculators that have the opportunity to do much more significant rent-seeking in spaces like these. So there are significant untapped sort of rent values within these spaces. And so clearly more political processes have to be at work that go a lot deeper than simply looking at electoral politics. So I'm going to focus primarily on the social movement struggles and on the collective actions that have resulted in sort of the permanence or the durability of spaces like this. But I did want to give some larger context that situates this. So the way that I talk about durability in the context of Dharavi within my larger work is partly a product of the economic and political centrality of the spaces. So thinking about these spaces as historically embedded and the networks that resulted in their emergence and the development of the productive industries, because as many of you know, and many of you have been thinking and looking at Dharavi for a lot longer than I have, that the economic networks that result in the productivity of these spaces extend far beyond the boundaries of the slum itself. And so thinking about the ways that these spaces are actually not marginal at all to the larger functioning of the city, but actually embedded in a much deeper set of political and social networks, economic networks that span the city and the slum. Secondly, the organizational density of spaces like this. So thinking about the vibrant civil society organizations, the presence of all of the city and most of the country's major political parties that have a presence within this area. So there are an immense number of institutional actors that have an interest in protecting these spaces. And that sort of speaks to the third point of political fragmentation, which I think was hinted at yesterday and talked about in certain ways in the context of state capacity or state failure. And I think that that's actually a pretty, a not very useful way to think about these processes, because it's not so much that the state as a monolithic actor sort of lacks the capacity to intervene in these spaces, but rather these spaces are comprised of multiple jurisdictions and overlapping agencies and institutions that actually have the capacity to act in the particular area, in many cases, in some cases don't, but have particular capacities to act to achieve their own specific objectives. And those objectives may often be at cross purposes with one another. So when we think about the capacity to enact redevelopment projects or to carry out public-private partnerships, thinking about disentangling this sort of monolithic category of the state or of civil society into who are the particular stakeholders, what are their interests, and how are they sort of undermining the larger project or coming at odds with one another. But as I said, I'm going to focus primarily around the struggles around the right to stay put today. And an important piece that sort of taps into the others before I sort of go a little bit deeper into that is the historical component and the ways that these spaces, we can't simply look at a plot of land and attempt a redevelopment project without thinking of the embedded histories of these spaces themselves, particularly as they pertain to collective actions. There are a whole series of repertoires and a series of attempted state interventions that create a particular set of possibilities for what government can achieve within those spaces and how residents will respond to those in terms of broken down trust. And so when I came to Dadavi, I actually believed that my project was going to look at sort of the politics of dispossession. And I had arrived in Mumbai about 6-7 months after the government of Maharashtra had launched the Dadavi redevelopment project. And there was so much sort of optimism, in a sense, and fear on the part of Dadavi residents that, despite earlier failed attempts to redevelop the settlement, this one would actually be successful for a variety of reasons. The political stars seemed to have aligned. There was significant investor interest from India's largest development firms as well as international investors. And there seemed like there was sort of the confluence of events, and I was sort of looking at what those events were. But the longer that I spent in Dadavi and the more I came to sort of think about this project in a larger historical context, it became apparent that what we're looking at with the Dadavi redevelopment project is quite similar to earlier attempts that had been made. The context is different in certain ways, but many of the features are the same. And in particular, I'd like to flag the 1948 master plan for the city of Bombay that actually had a Dadavi layout component in it. And many of those features included sort of removing the polluting and sort of the unregulated or under-regulated industries within Dadavi to outlying areas out of the island city, and reducing the population density of the area significantly, and constructing a significant amount of housing. And those are in many ways sort of the three main components of the contemporary Dadavi redevelopment project. And which is a case that's more familiar and has been written about, by people in this room, the 1985 Prime Minister's Grant Project, which brought 100 crore to Dadavi to achieve many of the same objectives: to reduce the population density, to remove the industry, and to construct housing. While the project wasn't a failure in some senses because some housing was constructed and infrastructure was improved, it didn't have the large sort of transformative outcomes that the project planners had initially sort of proposed. And so thinking about the project or thinking about this space, it's a space that has been highly contested with a variety of efforts to insert the government energy and private sector investment to sort of solve the Dadavi problem in many ways. So as I said sort of one of the, the main dominant framework for thinking about this space really is thinking about a land grab. And that was really the way that a lot of people had been talking about the project. You sort of hear this a lot less now that the project has sort of fallen into something of a holding pattern. But this was the dominant framework. I was at a seminar once where Arjuna Padarai referred to Dharavi as the eye of the storm of slum demolitions. And that's quite consistent with this, with this account written by David Harvey in the context of his accumulation by dispossession. This was a piece he wrote in 2008 in which he said, Dharavi, one of the most prominent slums in Mumbai, is estimated to be worth $2 billion. The pressure to clear it for environmental and social reasons that mask the land grab is mounting daily. Financial powers are backed by the state to push for forcible slum clearance, in some cases violently taking possession of terrain occupied for a whole generation. Capital accumulation through real estate activity booms since the land is acquired at no cost. So this perspective is largely derived from the financing model of the scheme, which really is an effort to turn over large parts of the property to market rate real estate developers in exchange for constructing housing for many of the existing residents. It sort of uses the basic financing model of Mumbai's existing slum rehabilitation scheme, but does it on a much larger scale. But the idea that approximately 2/3 of the space of Dharavi would be turned over to the private real estate market, along with increased FSIs and additional incentive to developers, really sort of fermented the idea that this was really not the ultimate objectives of the project were really not rehousing Dharavi's existing residents, but simply turning over a significant amount of land to property markets. And but while this hasn't happened, and one of the primary explanations that I offer for why the project has been undermined is the concept of the right to stay put. And both historically and in contemporary perspective, struggles around the right to stay put have really shaped land markets and property markets. And I want to be clear that that when I talk about this concept of the right to stay put, I'm not really talking about the right-based framework that Sharana hinted at yesterday, but is more the idea, sort of the repertoires that the residents themselves use to exert their, to resist displacement and to resist struggles to be moved. And I actually use the term the right to stay put in part to contrast it from broader frameworks that are often used to talk about these issues in the context of the right to the city. And I think while the right to the city has advantages in the way that we think about claims making in the city, I think the objectives of these efforts are much more narrowly focused on a much more instrumental set of objectives of simply not being moved. And while activists and civil society organizations may actually have these larger revolutionary aims, the amount of resources and energy that's simply put into resisting displacement because of these efforts to redevelop these settlements again and again, and the repertoires that have to be enacted actually undermine sort of these larger transformative objectives that civil society organizations might actually have, and they have to remain focused on the right to stay put. And so, I think that, I want to be careful that when I talk about these issues and the resistance, I'm not really talking about these, as a sort of, it's a double-edged sword, and I think that we have to acknowledge that, anti-displacement struggles are as much harmful and as they are sort of transformative and empowering. And when residents are sort of facing the constant threat of eviction and having to invoke these repertoires again, the repairs are not being made on homes and infrastructures are not actually being improved, and residents and activist groups have to put a significant amount of energy into these struggles in repeated ways. So in my project, I've looked at the ways that the right to stay put is manifested in the Dharavi project from the project's launch in 2004 through the through really the project's sort of essential abandonment in recent years. Yeah. So when I had first gotten to Dharavi to begin my work, there was really I do want to stand up for a minute. I'm not very good with the pointer. We were sort of in this phase of the process, and there was sort of this sort of negotiational politics that were underway that was really the government's response to direct action, a collective mobilization that took place in late 2004 and early 2005. And at that time, resident groups had mobilized a very familiar set of repertoires, and the same organizations that had been involved in earlier struggles resisting the PMGP and resisting, a variety of slum upgradation programs, sort of activated these repertoires and sort of demonstrated to the government that these sort of earlier attempts that they had first made, where residents were sort of sidelined from the initial sort of planning process, where there had been meetings with stakeholders, but people interpreted them as primarily pro forma and not sort of a meaningful form of engagement, that resistance had emerged in response to that and resulted in a sort of what seemed to be at that moment a more inclusive redevelopment process where there were negotiations taking place. And that did pacify and co-opt the resistance for a particular period. But I think the sort of the quiet with respect to the direct action at that moment sort of was emerging from a greater disillusionment that had emerged that the project was actually going to move forward. But in June 2007, when the global tender was floated and developers were invited to bid on the project, it remobilized these networks again, and the same actors sort of enacted these repertoires once again. And at that point, there was a mobilization of transnational networks and a greater effort to co-opt the opposition through certain concessions made, including increasing the space, increasing the eligibility requirements, or making a more inclusive project. But it sort of put us back into this sort of space around negotiation and co-optation, but sort of put us within a cycle where things will be enacted again. And so I think I'll sort of leave it there with thinking about the ways that we have to think about the institutional density of these spaces. We have to think about the historical embeddedness, the political institutions that all have an interest and a stake within these spaces, and these struggles. And we can't really neglect these processes and these political dynamics if we're actually going to construct housing in a way that that happens and doesn't result in sort of this type of failed project.